Okay, so extinction in and of itself isn't really evidence of evolution, but just kind of a vocab word, you know. Extinct means it's a species that no longer exists, like Blockbuster. You don't know what you don't know the joy of a Friday night with your friends, and you go to Blockbuster and you just roam around looking at random VHSs and DVDs, and or the stress of like renting a video game for 5 days, and you have to like try and beat it, and then you don't, and you're like, well, guess I gotta return this now. Mom won't let me buy it. So, anyways, evolution to species that dies off, and it's because of competition. So remember, for evolution to happen, one of the key things is you need competition. There's not limited resources, then there's not going to be some sort of adaptation or lack of adaptation in the case of extinction that will cause a species to die off or a species to be selected for. I bring up extinction to talk about the fossil record because one of the key pieces of evidence for evolution is the fossil record. And I've shown you this slide before where the idea of the fossil record, why it would be evidence for evolution is you would expect that when if life began from a single cell, you would expect the earliest life forms, meaning the oldest fossils, so the fossils you would find deepest down in the earth, to be a very, very simple organisms. You know, maybe just a single cells or just very small multicellular organisms. And that's what you see. So you see the earliest fossils will be single-celled organisms and very, very simple body-planned organisms. And then as you get to newer and newer fossils, you start to get to the development of more complex body plans. Fossils will be evidence for evolution because you talk about how evolution has changed over time, and the fossil record will clearly show there are organisms that once lived that now no longer live. So then, by definition, life has evolved. That's changed over time. We talked about radiometric dating. Why that would be evidence for evolution is, the idea would be like the deeper you go down in Earth, the older Earth would be, the older the rocks are. So you'd expect that if you find a fossil in a layer of rock that we've radiometrically dated using the radioactive isotopes to be really old, you would expect those fossils to also be really old and thus really simple body plans or more complex depending on the layer you find. And that's more or less what you find. You know, you don't typically, it's pretty rare that you find an example of a fossil you would date to be of a species that you would date evolutionarily to be younger in the older layer of the Earth. I believe perhaps they have found some that are out of order, and I'm not exactly sure how you would explain that. But I know generally speaking, this is the pattern you're going to find. So, this one's really interesting. So, Pangea, it's maybe been a minute, maybe since like elementary school, you've heard that word dropped on you, or maybe geography class they talked about it. But this is really interesting. So, the idea of Pangea is all of Earth's continents were together into one supercontinent. And then, because of plate tectonics and such, the one supercontinent broke apart into our separate continents, and then we kind of had the general layout of the globe that we have today. Well, what's interesting is if you were to look at the parts of South America that would have fit into, like, say, Africa, or parts of India that fit into Africa, or Australia to Antarctica, and so on, and you look at the fossils you find, you will see that the fossils that you find actually match up with what you would have expected to see if like all of Earth was part of that one supercontinent. So like the range of fossils in South America line up again with that area that would have overlapped with Africa during Pangea. So yeah, it's more I think specifically evidence for Pangea than perhaps like evolution, like from one single cell. But I think it's just kind of really interesting kind of record there to take note of. So another piece of evidence is this idea of like developmental changes. The idea is you look at different organisms, and I think kind of a critique of evolution can be, hey, there's life can be very, very complex, a lot of different life forms. How could you have something as like a human, but then you also have something as like crazy as like a butterfly, and all these different shaped organisms? How could that possibly happen genetically? Well, what we do know, the exact answer to that we don't quite know the answer to, but what we do know is that there are these groups of genes that will control body planning. And so small changes, mutations in those genes that control body planning, that might control like how many wings you have, or segmentation, or thinking that like the fruit fly lab, like where the wings are at, or like the antennae and stuff like that. Small genetic changes can actually make big changes in the overall look of an organism. Meaning what you would think would be, there would be massive genetic differences between this insect and this insect, massive genetic changes. Really, there isn't that big of a genetic change. It's just small changes in genes that really play huge, major overall roles in the body development plan. Okay. This one is somewhat related to what I was talking about with like Pangea. It's really about the same idea. Oh wait, no, actually this one doesn't talk about that. This one's talking about, like, you look at these 4 different organisms, they all appear to be very similar. This is getting to something called divergent evolution, where they all appear to be very similar. Excuse me, it's not divergent evolution. They all appear to be very similar, but they all have similar adaptations. Now, the reason they all have similar adaptations is because they all are living and have evolved in similar ecosystems that have similar, like, climates and rainfall and stuff like that. That environment has selected for those adaptations that would allow them to survive in those environments. So they don't actually share a recent common ancestor, but they have similar adaptations due to their environment. Okay. This is kind of looking at Darwin's finches. This is really interesting, actually. If you were to look at if you have a bigger landmass, so like if I were to, so say here's like the nearest like kind of continental landmass. If you were to look at the species on this island compared to the species on this island, the species here would more closely resemble the species here than the species here would resemble the species here. I'm going to say that again. The species here resemble the mainland more than the species over here. The closer the island is to the mainland, the more closer the species resemble the mainland. The idea would be somewhat similar to like Founder's effect, where the idea would be the species here migrated to this nearest island, and then over time, species here migrated to those islands, something like that. So, anyways, just trying to show you that, yeah, within island populations, you can have a variation. So, like, kind of looking at Darwin's finches and stuff, like, not all the species here are going to be the same. They're going to evolve to adapt to their own original, to the environment that, like beak size, that would allow them to survive best on that specific island. Okay, then there's the genetic evidence, which we talked about before, like just how DNA is called like the universal language. All cells will have some sort of genetic information encoded in DNA. And then we get an idea of like the evolutionary relationship of 2 species by comparing the similarities of their DNA. So like, at least according to 23andMe.com, 98% of our DNA is similar to chimps, which, only 18% of that resembles a plant, or 26% resembles a yeast. And that reflects the evolutionary relationship that we see, and that also overlaps pretty well with like the fossil record. So there you go. And then, speaking of like the fossil record, so if you were to, before they had genetic evidence, they would use the fossil record to compare, get an idea of evolutionary lineage. Well, now that we have modern day genetics and stuff, we can use, basically we can compare genes among organisms. And here they compared something called cytochrome C. So they compared the gene that controls cytochrome C in all these different organisms. Now, anybody remember what cytochrome C did? I don't believe I made you memorize it specifically, but you may have seen you should have seen on one of the diagrams we went over. Give you a hint. It was in the metabolism unit and cellular respiration. It was in the electron transport chain. Its role was to help shuttle those electrons down the electron transport chain. So why would that be why do they focus on that cytochrome C? Like, why would they look at cytochrome C and not some other different protein? Why would they compare that among different organisms and not something else? The answer is it's highly conserved. think about it. If you're a yeast and you had a mutation to your cytochrome C protein, you're probably gonna die. Like there's not the cytochrome C is so well adapted already that there's not too many more improvements you can make to it, so it doesn't change very often. Or when it does change, it will change at a very predictable rate. So what we do is that can be essentially like a stopwatch for evolution, where the more changes you see between the cytochrome C of two species, and cytochrome C is present in essentially nearly every single organism that I'm aware of. So it functions as a good comparison to use. So it's kind of like how you can compare like how old a house is, or like how recently it's been painted maybe, by like how faded the paint job is. That's a somewhat similar idea. There are 42 different amino acid changes in the cytochrome C of yeast compared to humans, compared to there's none when you compare the chimpanzees to the humans. So that shows that chimpanzees and humans share a more recent common ancestor since they have fewer changes. Compare that to the rabbits, like the rabbit and the human share even further common ancestor compared to the chimpanzee because there's more changes in that cytochrome C. So, anyways, now there's homologous structures. So homologous structure is kind of interesting because you'll look at like when they make these evolutionary trees, you're like, how is it possible that like all of these things could share a common ancestor? They seem to have vastly different like physical features, but if you actually hammer down the genetics of how those structures develop, you'll get these things called homologous structures. Where if you look at like the bones that make up a human arm, a cat's leg, a whale's flipper, a bat's wing, they actually share some like the same parts more or less. Those parts are just used, those bones are used for a different structure. So the number and arrangement of the bones in a bat wing versus human hand, all of these, is actually about the same. They just formed if they have different functions. They call that an example of divergent evolution. So you get a bunch of different traits that have diverged from one common body plan. Okay. Then there's analogous structures. So analogous structures are basically the opposite, where like if you look at like a butterfly, a bat, and a bird, they all have wings, but they don't share a recent common ancestor. So essentially, this the wing trait has evolved at different points throughout evolution, based on the environment, based on that adaptation being something favorable in the environment. So the environment would select over time for more and more different environments over time would select for the wing alleles, and so that would eventually evolve in different populations. So analogous structures, like think of an analogy. You make an analogy, take two different things, but you compare them to each other. So they're different organisms, don't share a recent common ancestor, but they have the same wings. Two more. One is vestigial structures. So what does a vestige of history mean? If I use that phrase, like, the flip phone is a vestige of history. Blockbuster is a vestige of history. It's like, it once served a purpose, now it no longer does. A vestigial structure is a structure in an organism that once had a purpose and no longer does. So the idea would be of a vestigial structure is you would expect, if evolution is true, that some like humans or something that are like came about more recently in evolution, they should have we should have some features in us that at one point perhaps played a role, but they don't really play much of a role now. And the appendix would be one, goosebumps, wisdom teeth. The appendix is a little more controversial because there is some bacteria in there that they think kind of help with like some digestive stuff, but appendicitis, you hear people have issues that are like, there's a bunch of bacteria in there, and basically appendicitis itis means inflammation. This gets inflamed, and then it can, if that bursts, you can release bacteria inside your body cavity, which is going to kill you. That's why appendicitis is like a major issue, and it causes a lot of pain. Anyways, the appendix just kind of sucks and doesn't really play, at least that we know of, a super important role. Goosebumps. Do we know like the idea of goosebumps? Like why you get goosebumps? Frustrating.
I think it was kind of like when birds or cats, when they get scared, they puff up to make themselves look bigger.
Yeah, right.
Kind of,
or like my dog. Yeah, right. Yeah, like animals will puff up to make themselves appear bigger. That's the idea behind goosebumps. So that's why, like, if you get like scared or something, you'll kind of get like your hair will stand up. The idea is you're trying to make yourself look bigger. But like humans have evolved to like not have as much hair. So like if I get goosebumps and my hair stands up, it's not that intimidating. So that's the idea behind goosebumps. Wisdom teeth. I don't know if you got your wisdom teeth out, but the idea would be our diets, you know, back in like Neanderthal times, having the wisdom teeth, that extra layer of teeth back there would have been more beneficial. But our diets now, they just don't really play much of a role for us. So, anyways, last thing is similarities in development. It kind of reminds me a little bit when we talked about, I was telling you about they call them the Hox genes, those genes that have big influences on body structure. Where when you look at a human, a chicken, a tortoise, a salamander, a fish, they look very, very different, and they are very different. You're like, how is it possible they could have possibly shared a common ancestor at some point? Well, what's interesting is you look at the very early embryo, you know, the developing fish, human, you know, and so on. The earliest stage actually will have very similar looking features. If I showed you a fish embryo versus a human embryo, you actually probably would have a difficult time telling the difference unless you're like a trained embryologist. Humans will even have like, they call them gill slits. These would have evolved into the gills of like your fish. And these would become our lungs and some other organs that that I forget. But these would become our modern day lungs and stuff. So the idea would be, again, different species develop in similar ways. So that's kind of how you could start to explain how different looking species could actually have a common ancestor. So, any questions? Okay. So you got a short mastering bio. Not due next class, but you could get started on it if you wanted to.